Hello everybody. Today we're going to take this cardigan, which my brother accidentally felted in the wash, and turn it into something new. Instead of letting it go to waste, I thought, why not turn it into a personalized garland for my niece Ellie's room? This is going to be a slow, relaxed project, no rushing, no stress, just some good old-fashioned crafting, and me sharing my thoughts about crafting and some other stuff. So grab a drink, maybe a project of your own, and let's just hang out for a while. Since I know that I want the garland to consist of the letters in her name, I started by measuring the cardigan to get an idea of how large the letters can be. Then I sketch out the letters in that size on a piece of paper. I just kinda draw them out how I imagined them in my head. I want them to be fun and bubbly. My niece is only soon turning 3, so I want them to be fun to look at for her. I always like to sketch on paper first, instead of drawing anything directly to the fabric. Always have some sort of a plan, because sometimes it's better to stop and think things through rather than cutting the only pieces you have for a project wrong. And trust me, sketching doesn't have to be fancy or anything, and you don't have to be a lettering master to make something like this. Just try something out. You're not trying to make a masterpiece here, it's you making something with your hands. And done is better than perfect. And practice and trying stuff out is actually a very important part of being creative. And sketching your plan out is a great tool to help you visualize your ideas and transform them from just being inside of your head. And that's why I always use pencil at first, because it allows me to make mistakes, erase them, and move on and better myself. Now that I like how it looks, I'm going over the letters with a black marker. These letters will now work as a stencil for drawing the letters on the cardigan. I used a marker to outline the letters on the cardigan. Then, using my sharpest scissors, I cut the letters out. Even though these were my largest and sharpest scissors, it was actually pretty hard to cut through this extremely thick felt. When they were all cut, I was pretty pleased with how they looked. They looked a little rough on the edges though, so I wanted to clean up the look a little. I chose to sew around the edges using a simple blanket stitch. I first up tried with a rather thick yarn and found it really hard to pull through the thick felt. That was hard to say. So I switched to a thinner yarn and that worked better. I tried out different lengths and colors of yarn for the edge, and the further I came to being done with this step, the less I liked one of the colors I picked. It was just too light comparing to the others, and the contrast was just annoying me, so I decided to pick out the yarn. It reminded me of a thing my weaving teacher taught me. When I studied as a textile designer, she said, "Make your work look handmade, but never homemade." And that is basically what I thought about that color combination. I wanted to spare the yarn, and I was worried that the felt would be too fragile after the yarn was pulled out. So I went as careful as I could. That's why I only used a needle to rip it out. And that really reminded me of another time when I studied as an upholstery, the ones that put new textile on furniture and stuff. One time at school there, we were doing a project for a bigger company, where we were using a very expensive fabric to cover some chairs. I had been sewing for about an hour that day before I found out that I had made a mistake all the way through. And I went to discuss with my teacher what I could do to undo the mistake. She told me that there was no way I could place a seam ripper anywhere near that expensive fabric, and I had to use a needle to carefully undo all the stitches one by one. I spent the rest of the 6 hours that day fixing that 1 hour mistake. And I guess from that day on, I never really feel bad about undoing anything that takes less than an hour. I'm all about killing your darlings, and often something cool will happen if you do so. And even though I started the video talking about being mindful and measuring twice, cutting once, I also firmly believe that you can't be scared when crafting. You just need to get even more creative on how to recycle your materials. I got kinda stubborn about the thick yarn I started out trying to sew with, and I just really wanted it to work out because I had a clear vision with one of the letters' edge being a little chunkier than the others. That's why I had to pull out my secret weapon, pliers. With that, I actually managed to get the edges done. The plier trick has helped me countless times when embroidering. I could have continued with some needle felting decorations on the letters or even adding some beads or something like that. But I'm not going to spend an eternity on this project, which I totally have a tendency to do. I usually get sucked up into a project and spend countless hours on it. And unfortunately, I don't have the opportunity to do so with this project, so I'll try to keep my choices pretty simple here. So for finishing off the letters, I just trimmed away any excess felt fluff from the edges, making them look sharper. Now it's time to make the flowers. And for the flowers, my first choice is, what material should I pick? And because the letters are felt, I picked out all the felt scraps I had laying around, but when I got them out, I noticed that the colors were all over the place, and I had a hard time at first figuring out how they naturally would go well together for my niece's room. If you ever struggle with mismatched colors, one trick is to look for a bridge color, something that ties everything together. For me, that ended up being autumn-inspired tones. I find it's a good idea to look for color palettes in nature, especially if you're in doubt on what to pick. Another trick is to mix warm and cool tones intentionally. If everything is one temperature, it can feel too flat. A little contrast makes everything pop. And hey, if all else fails, just go monochrome. Different shades of the same color family will always work together. But unfortunately, I didn't have anywhere near enough purple tones to do that, and did not want to spend any money on the project since the customer, my soon-to-be 3-year-old niece, wasn't intending to pay for this to be done. When I recycle stuff, especially clothing, I always like to check if I can reuse any details before cutting. These buttons are too nice to throw away, so I'm going to use them for the center of my flowers. That would also leave traces of the former life it had as a cardigan. If your wool hasn't felted all the way through, you might notice it's still fraying at the edges when you cut it. In that case, you can do a few things. 1. Felt it more, just wash it in hot water again and toss it in the dryer. 2. Use fabric glue on the back to keep fibers from unraveling. Although I would always recommend finding other solutions first before choosing glue. 3. Stitch the edges before cutting. This helps to reinforce it. Now that I've decided on my color palette, I need to figure out what kind of flowers I actually want to make. I could freehand them, but I find it easier to make a stencil first. Especially when I'm working with felt, that way I get a more uniform shape and I don't end up wasting material. For the petal shape, I actually use one of the buttons I cut off earlier as a starting point. Once I had a shape I liked, I cut it out. I made a second smaller petal stencil too, because I thought different sizes would make a more natural and balanced look. Alright, now that I have my stencils, I'm just tracing them onto the felt scraps and cutting them out. I'm doing a mix of colors. Some flowers are all in one shade, while others have a contrasting petals laying on top. If you're doing this yourself and you're struggling with cutting felt cleanly, make sure you're using really sharp scissors. If your scissors are dull, they'll just tear up the edges and make them look messy. And if you're cutting multiple layers at once to save time, pin them together first so they don't shift around on you. I don't have that many to cut, so I just cut one by one. This is a project I do while just turning my head off and listening to a podcast. So I'm not in a rush with anything, and I love being in the process. Now I just need to put everything together, starting off with sewing the petals together. I tried 2 different techniques, where on the first flower, I just sewed them together directly on top of each other. But when I finished that one, I figured that it got a too flat look for my liking, since I'd like the flowers to have a little more dimension in them. That's why I, with the next flower, sewed them together with a little overlap on the petals, so each individual petal was overlapping the next and was overlapped by the previous. That created a much more natural flower look, and that's what I kept doing with the rest of the flowers as well. On 2 of the flowers, I also added an outer layer of the felt to kind of replicate leaves on the flower. I thought that would look cool for the 2 outer flowers to give the overall garland a more luscious look. When all the petals were assembled, it was time to sew on the cardigan's buttons in the center of each flower. Alright, time to sew these buttons on. I'm just using a yarn in the almost same color as the felt. And then you just sew it on, finishing up with some stitches in the back to lock it in place. You don't need to overcomplicate this. If your flowers are looking a little lifeless, try this. Instead of just sewing the layers flat, add some stitches in the center that gathers the petals slightly. It gives them more shape and makes them look a little more natural. Another trick is to mix up the petal shapes. Maybe some are rounder, some are pointier. That way, they don't all look exactly the same, which makes the design more interesting. That's not what I did, but you could definitely play around with different shapes for your petals. Now that the letters and flowers are ready, I need something to attach them to. I found this purple edge banding in my stash and I think it works perfectly. Since it's actually meant for finishing fabric edges, it's kind of like a little too wide, which means I need to sew the sides shut before I use this as a garland base. First, I switch out the thread in my sewing machine to match the fabric. I'm just running a straight stitch down the edge to close it up. And then I'm making 2 little loops at each end. These will act as the mounting loops, so it can hang on the wall easily. If you don't have a sewing machine, don't worry, you can totally do this by hand, or even use fabric glue if you really need to. But since I already have the machine out, I'm just going to stitch it up real quick. This machine and I aren't great friends, but as I also said earlier, done is better than perfect. Alright, before I start sewing the letters on, I need to make sure they're centered. The easiest way to do this is to fold the band in half and mark the middle with a pin. Since Ellie's name has 5 letters, the middle letter is L, so I'm starting with that one and working outward from there. I'm sewing these on by hand because I want full control of the placement, and trying to run this through a sewing machine would probably just end in frustration, especially with the machine I have. I'm just using small stitches so the letters stay secure without any visible thread showing on the front side. You could also use fabric glue here if you want a no-sew option, but I prefer stitching. Now I'm just filling in the empty spaces with the flowers. I want it to feel balanced but not too symmetrical. Just kind of natural scattered look, spend some time playing with the placement. I'm also making sure to leave enough space between everything so the garland doesn't look too crowded. Sometimes when you're working with small pieces, it's tempting to cram them all together, but leaving a little breathing room makes the whole design look a little more intentional. And that's it. I love how this turned out. Thank you for hanging out with me today and let me know what you think. And if you try a project like this, I'd love to hear about it, so see you next time.